The Second Great Awakening has a huge impact on American history. It has a religious impact, then it has a social impact, and it even goes further. So let's first talk about what the Second Great Awakening is. First of all, the Second Great Awakening was a religious movement that really kind of got started off big time in the United States right around the year 1800. And so you have lots of preachers going across the country, and they have revivals, which were intended to bring people closer to their relationship with God through Jesus, it was a pretty amazing event. You've got Charles Grandison Finney, who's going to be one of the big players of the Second Great Awakening. Now, he had camp meetings all over the countryside. He would go in, he would set up a tent, he would have meetings for several nights out of the week, and lots of people would come to know Christ as their personal Savior. And through this, he was teaching a very different Jesus Christ than had been taught before. Let me see if I can make this simple for you. The prevailing idea before Charles Finney was the idea of Calvinism. Calvinism was the idea that if you're going to be saved, you're going to be saved, and there's really not a whole lot you do about it. You know, God comes to you, God calls you. Finney says that's not the case. Finney says you can choose if you want to be saved. You can go to God without Him coming to you first. And he also said that if you want to be saved and stay saved, you've got to have these things called good works. Everybody knows what good works are, good deeds. And then remember the old proverbial thing that if your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, then you go to heaven. And so that's where this idea comes from, all the way back to about 1800. And so the idea of free will, the idea of good works for salvation is going to lead to a lot of movements across the country. We're going to talk about these in order. We're going to talk about some of the things that involve the temperance movement. We're going to talk about the free education movement, the common school movement. We're going to talk about the asylum reform. We're going to talk about the women's reform and their suffrage movement. And we're going to talk about abolitionism. But before we get into that, let's talk specifically about how this affects religion specifically. Not only does he change the way that most Christians view religion, but he also is going to, not necessarily him, but his movement, the Second Great Awakening, is going to spur the growth of several other religions like the Mormon movement. The Mormons come on the scene in 1830 when Joseph Smith says he receives a message from God through an angel, and he has a message on these golden plates. His religion is going to have very few followers at first, but eventually there'll be several people following him, including a guy by the name of Brigham Young. Now, Joseph Smith is not a very popular guy, especially because of what he teaches in the idea of polygamy, a man having more than one wife. And so a lot of Americans are like, whoa, what's going on here? And so there's a lot of resistance to that, and Joseph Smith faces persecution. Now, they move around the country several times until Joseph Smith is finally assassinated, and Brigham Young takes over the church. Brigham Young moves his people out to Utah, and that's why Utah, even to this day, has a very large Mormon population. There's other religious movements that are going on at this time. The Shakers, these are followers of the Bible. They are a Christian movement, but they don't believe in sexual intercourse at all. They are celibate, and they believe in full equality between men and women. Now, not to sound too silly here, but the Shakers are going to have a hard time filling their ranks, because if there's no children coming into these families, then they can't extend and expand their religion. So the Shakers are a fairly short-lived movement for the most part. Then we have the other thing going on at this time, which is a spring off from the Second Great Awakening, which is this thing called the Utopian Community Movement. You have some very smart people, educated people, college professors, doctorates, who are trying to see how they can better society. And most of these people are doing it outside of religion, but some of them are using religion as they build their utopian communities. So we've got utopian communities that are built on the idea of equality, socialism, everyone is equal pay, give you a place to live, give you something to do for work, but they're not very successful. The utopian communities generally last anywhere between 5 and 10 years, if they last that long, because the incentive comes out of it when you put in that socialism component. And so we have several utopian communities but none of them are successful, and none of them last more than just a few years. There's a very famous one that's right here in our own area. Just outside of Dallas, there's a utopian community that's called the La Reunion Colony, and it's about 5 miles west of Dallas. The La Reunion Colony collapses after about 5 years, but the residents that live there are going to move into Dallas, and because of the significance of those members that moved to Dallas, the La Reunion Colony has an attraction to the area, and Reunion Tower, the big famous tower with the ball on it that's famous for Dallas, is actually named for the La Reunion Colony. Now, besides the utopian communities and the religious movements of the Second Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening also is going to spur some social movements. The temperance movement is going to come out of the Second Great Awakening because people that were drinking, and by the way, people that drank back then drank about twice as much as people drink today. The average consumption of liquor, I'm talking about hard alcohol, not just beers and wines, but the average consumption of liquor was about double what it is today, and that doesn't include the beer consumption. So men would come home, they would be drunk, they would beat their wives, they would have a lot of family issues, domestic disturbances, and so a lot of mostly women formed the society, the American Temperance Society in 1826. And the purpose of this was to just ban alcohol completely from society. The Women's Christian Temperance Movement forms in 1873, many years after, but eventually these movements will build until we pass our very own amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the 18th Amendment, which will ban alcohol. Now that comes 100 years later, but it's interesting to see where its origins are from right here in the Second Great Awakening. We also have the Common School movement, which really gets started in Massachusetts. Horace Mann is a Massachusetts official who is going to open the first free public school. And after he opens his first free public school, it's going to spread like wildfire across the country. And it won't be but just a couple of decades, and there will be free public schools in almost every state. Not only will we have free public schools, but we'll have state-sponsored colleges and universities, mostly of the A&M type, agricultural and mechanical. People who were deemed insane during this time period were treated very badly. They were put into what was nothing more than a prison, but in many cases it was even worse than your average prison, where these people would be chained to the walls and in some cases even experimented on, and it was a terrible environment. Dorothea Dix is going to spend the better part of her life trying to reform this part of American society and create mental institutions very similar to what we have today, not exactly the same, but ways to try to help these people rather than to just chain them to a wall or to lock them into a cell in no better shape than a common criminal. And so her work is going to be very effective in cleaning up these asylums and creating a standard to where these people have at least a shot at a life that is not like living in a prison. Women are going to lead many of these organizations, many of these reform movements, and so they're going to gain a lot of confidence that they're more than just the wife to their man. They're more than just the domestic proprietor of their home. They're more than just the cooker and the cleaner of that home. They're going to get confidence that they can take charge not just in these reform areas, but they can also work in politics as well. And so that's going to convince many women that they need and they deserve the right to vote. So the women's movement is also going to come out of this reform era, and Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are going to be very effective in organizing these women early on. In 1848, they're going to gather and they're going to have a meeting at Seneca Falls, New York, where they will talk about this publicly, and they will actually have some men join them and say, yeah, this is a good movement for you guys to be in. And one of these such men is Frederick Douglass, who says, you shouldn't even leave this event until you've drawn up a document that says you demand the right to vote. That will lead to the Declaration of Sentiments, which is the first time women will write down, this is what we want and this is how we want to do it. And it, of course, will not be fulfilled until almost 100 years later with the 19th Amendment in 1920. The last but probably the most important reform movement of all is abolitionism. Abolitionism is a very complicated topic because on one hand we think of abolitionism as a bunch of people who are gathering around wanting to free the slaves. But in reality, if we lump all abolitionists into the same group, we're missing a very important component here. Most of the abolitionists, if you include the Free Soil movement, which theoretically was part of the abolitionist movement, the Republican Party that leads to the Civil War, that movement, they are not really the same kind of abolitionists that we have grown to expect. So let's talk about the different branches of abolitionism and how they get started. First of all, abolitionism in many cases started in the South because that's where people were closest to slavery. But it doesn't take long with northern abolitionists, the abolitionists that were considered the moral abolitionists or the abolitionists that were considered the radical abolitionists, that they begin to condone things like violence and murder to free the slaves, that abolitionism in the South is going to completely be eradicated and disappear because no one wants to be associated with abolitionism that would lead to violence or the death of their fellow citizens. Now, let's talk about the origins of abolitionism on the larger scale. The American Colonization Society was founded in 1816, all the way back in American history into that period that we call the era of good feelings. Now, at this point, most people who were abolitionists believed that black people, black Americans, African Americans would be better off if they were taken back to their homeland in Africa because they felt like they would never get a good shake in American society due to racism and prejudices of the day. So the American Colonization Society would raise money to purchase African Americans and put them on ships and take them back to Africa. This is where we get the country of Liberia from, and their own national capital is going to be named after the American president, who was also a member, James Monroe, and the name of that capital is Monrovia even to this day. Now, moving forward from this type of abolitionism, we're going to get into the free soil type of abolitionism, and we're going to get into the moral abolitionism. Moral abolitionism is the one that most people are familiar with today. That would be the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe type of abolitionism. David Walker and William Lloyd Garrison. Those are some famous abolitionists of the day who were very moral abolitionists. They were for full equality. They were for immediate end to slavery, but they also would support violence as a means necessary to free the slaves. The Free Soilers are also loosely based into the abolitionist category, and they'll be the foundation of the Republican Party, but they're not that kind of an abolitionist. These were white men who wanted to end slavery, especially in the Western territories that were about to become states, because they wanted those territories reserved for white men. They didn't want black people in those territories at all. So be careful when you see these abolitionist movements when they lump the Free Soilers in, because when you lump the Free Soilers in, which by the way, if you had a number of abolitionists and you divided them up, just a very tiny percentage of abolitionists would be moral abolitionists. In the 1840 and 1844 election, they made up about 2% of the entire voting population of the United States. That's not very many people. But by the 1850s, when they coalesced together in the Republican Party, more than 90% of Republicans were Free Soilers, including Abraham Lincoln, who was not, and many of these people were not in favor of freeing the slaves, but they wanted to keep the territories free from slaves. They didn't want the expansion of slavery into the territories because they wanted them reserved for free white men. So the idea of abolitionism is a very convoluted one, but do remember that the origins of the abolitionist movement were from the Reform era, from the Second Great Awakening, which had very good intentions to do good things so that slaves would be freed. And then, of course, from there, that movement will splinter. We'll talk more about that as we move into the coming of the Civil War and Manifest Destiny specifically.